Imagine an all-powerful God, a being with unlimited power. He can create galaxies, rewrite the laws of nature, stop time, and supposedly do absolutely anything. Now ask him to perform one simple task: create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it. If God can create the rock, there is something he cannot do: lift it. But if God cannot create the rock, there is also something he cannot do: create it. Either way, God fails to do something. So it appears that an all-powerful being cannot exist. This is called the omnipotence paradox. It sounds like a cheap verbal trick, but it exposes a genuinely difficult question. What does it actually mean to have unlimited power? And when philosophers try to answer that question, they end up confronting the nature of logic, free will, self-limitation, and whether the phrase "can do anything" even makes sense. Let's write the problem more precisely. Suppose God is omnipotent, meaning God can perform every possible action. Now define an action. Create an object that God cannot lift. There are only two apparent outcomes. First, God cannot create it. In that case, creating the rock is an action God cannot perform. Second, God creates it. But now lifting the rock is an action God cannot perform. So regardless of what God does, there is at least one thing he cannot do. The same structure appears in other questions. Can God create another being more powerful than himself? Can God make himself permanently cease to exist? Can God create a prison from which he cannot escape? Can God make a rule that even he is incapable of breaking? These questions all force unlimited power to turn against itself. They ask whether power can be so great that it successfully destroys its own greatness. It is the philosophical version of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. But there is an important question hiding underneath all of this. Is creating an unliftable rock a genuine action, or is it just a contradiction disguised as a sentence? This is the most common philosophical answer. God can do anything that is logically possible. He could create a planet, suspend gravity, resurrect the dead, or turn every rock on Earth into gold. These events may violate the laws of physics as we understand them, but they are not necessarily contradictions. A logical contradiction is different. Consider the command, draw a square circle. You can say the words, but there is no object that could satisfy them. A square must have straight sides and corners. A circle cannot have straight sides or corners. If you change either definition enough to produce the object, it is no longer both a square and a circle. Likewise, consider, create a married bachelor. That is not an extremely difficult person to create. It is a self-contradictory description. According to philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, contradictions do not describe incredibly challenging tasks. They fail to describe tasks at all. Now return to the rock. An unliftable rock only makes sense relative to a being with limited lifting power. You can create a rock that I cannot lift because my strength has an upper limit. But if God has unlimited power, then a rock an unlimited being cannot lift is internally contradictory. It effectively means, create an object that unlimited power is too limited to move. On this view, God's inability to create the rock is no more a weakness than his inability to create the rock is no more a weakness than his inability to draw a square circle. Logic is not overpowering God. The request simply has no coherent outcome. There is an obvious objection. We began by saying God could do anything. Now we have changed it to God can do anything, as long as it obeys certain rules. Doesn't that mean logic is more powerful than God? Not necessarily. Logical laws are not normally understood as physical barriers surrounding God. Logic describes whether our words refer to a coherent possibility. Suppose I challenge the strongest weightlifter in the world to win a race without winning, losing, or tying. If he cannot do it, that tells us nothing about his athletic ability. I have failed to specify a possible result. In the same way, saying God cannot make 2 + 2 = 5 while keeping every number and operation unchanged may not identify a limitation in God. It identifies a contradiction in the request. Under this definition, omnipotence does not mean producing nonsense on command. It means that every genuine possibility is within God's power. A related answer defines omnipotence in terms of God's nature. In classical Christianity, God is not merely a very powerful person. God is understood as necessarily perfect, rational, and good. That creates other apparent limitations. Can God lie? Can God make a mistake? Can God become morally evil? Can God stop being God? If the answer is no, does that make God less powerful? Classical theologians usually answer that lying, failing, and becoming corrupted are not expressions of greater power. They are defects. A person who cannot be bribed is not weaker than someone who can. A mathematician who cannot be tricked by an elementary equation does not have less mathematical ability. So, this view defines omnipotence as the ability to bring about any logically possible state consistent with God's essential nature. The cost is clear. God can do absolutely anything is no longer literally true without qualification. But supporters argue that the qualification was always necessary. Otherwise, omnipotence would require God to possess every weakness as well as every strength, the ability to be defeated, confused, manipulated, and accidentally destroyed. At that point, unlimited power would start to mean its exact opposite. There's another, more unusual possibility. Perhaps God could create the rock, but only by limiting his own power. Imagine that God temporarily gives up the ability to lift objects above a certain mass. He then creates a rock beyond that limit. At that moment, the rock is genuinely too heavy for him. Problem solved? Not quite. If God can immediately restore his power, then the rock was never truly beyond his ultimate control. He can regain his strength and lift it. But if God removes his power permanently and cannot restore it, then he has stopped being omnipotent. That gives us a strange sequence. At time 1, God is omnipotent. At time 2, he uses his omnipotence to become non-omnipotent. Some philosophers and theologians accept that voluntary self-limitation is possible. Christian discussions of God entering human life, for example, sometimes involve the idea that divine power can be deliberately restrained. But this only answers the paradox if omnipotence means a being can surrender its unlimited power. It does not produce a being that remains omnipotent while simultaneously facing a genuinely impossible rock. Self-limitation moves the contradiction across time. It does not allow both conditions to be true at once. A more radical response says that God is not bound by logic at all. Perhaps God can create the unliftable rock and lift it anyway. Perhaps both statements can be true, even though they contradict each other. Some forms of extreme divine voluntarism move in this direction. Logic itself depends on God, rather than placing an independent boundary around him. This protects the strongest possible version of omnipotence. God can do literally anything, including what humans call contradictions. But the price is enormous. If contradictions can be true, then reasoning about God becomes almost impossible. God could exist and not exist. God could be omnipotent and powerless. Every argument for God could be valid and invalid simultaneously. Even the sentence God can do anything would no longer have a stable meaning, because God could also be unable to do anything. Once logic is abandoned, the paradox disappears, but so does our ability to make meaningful claims about the solution. It is less like solving the puzzle and more like destroying the rules that allow puzzles to exist. Another approach is to reject the entire definition of omnipotence. Philosopher Peter Geik distinguished between being omnipotent in the abstract and being almighty. An almighty God does not need the ability to satisfy every strange sentence humans can construct. Instead, God has supreme authority and cannot be defeated by any external power. No creature can overpower him. No event can occur completely outside his control. Nothing else ranks above him. This avoids many self-referential puzzles because divine power is defined relationally. God is greater than every other existing power. The rock paradox then becomes irrelevant. It does not describe an external rival overpowering God. It asks God to become his own superior. That may be a contradiction, but it is not a meaningful test of whether God rules over creation. So, does the rock paradox disprove God? Not by itself. What it successfully disproves is one crude definition. An omnipotent being can make every grammatically correct sentence become true. That definition collapses because language can combine words into impossible instructions. Make a triangle with 4 sides. Create something that was never created. Change the past while leaving it completely unchanged. Lose a contest that you necessarily win. These are valid arrangements of words, but grammar alone does not guarantee that they describe possible events. The rock paradox therefore forces believers to clarify what they mean by divine power, but that clarification has a consequence. If someone claims that God can literally do anything without exception, the paradox remains devastating. They cannot appeal to logical possibility after defining God as unrestricted, even by logic. They must either narrow the definition of omnipotence or accept that rational discussion has reached its limit. The deepest lesson of the omnipotence paradox is not really about rocks. It is about whether power can include the power to contradict itself. The most coherent answer is that omnipotence covers every logically possible action. An unliftable rock for a permanently omnipotent being is not a possible object. It is a contradiction, like a square circle or a married bachelor. The self-limitation answer is possible, but only if God can stop being omnipotent. The above logic answer preserves absolute power, but makes every statement about God unstable. And the almighty answer avoids the trap by defining God's power as supreme authority, rather than the ability to perform nonsense. So the paradox does not leave us with a simple choice between a rock God cannot create and a rock God cannot lift. It leaves us with a more fundamental choice. Either omnipotence operates within logic, or the word omnipotence no longer communicates a logically understandable idea. And perhaps the strangest conclusion is this: the one thing unlimited power cannot do is make a contradiction stop being a contradiction, without also making the very idea of unlimited power meaningless.